different time and place than we live in now, but that time and place is still influencing the time we live in now, which is why I'm making this presentation in the first place. So Austin first appeared as a character in a poem by Bret Harte, which was first titled Plain Language from Truthful James, and then retitled The Heathen Chinese, which is, of course, Chinese being a derogatory term for Chinese person by his publishers. It was hugely popular, and it made him the most celebrated literary man in America in 1870. So that tells you the popular support for this, for these representations of Chinese people at the time. First appeared, let's see, okay. A stanza from the poem reads this, which is why I remark, and my language is plain, that for ways that are dark and for tricks that are vain, the heathen Chinese is peculiar, which the same I am free to maintain. Peculiarity, difference, otherness, again, being perpetuated. Notice the images of lightness or darkness, trickery, heathen, all these things elided together. The role of Austin was originated by Charles Parslow, who was praised for the veracity of his presentation. Veracity, of course, meaning truthfulness. A newspaper reviewer called Mr. Parslow's Chinaman said, Parslow's Chinaman could scarcely exceed, let me start over. Mr. Parslow's Chinaman could be scarcely exceeded in truthfulness to nature and freedom from caricature. Looking at the picture here, you can obviously see, makes you wonder, what did this reviewer see when he looked at this man? Even from this still photograph, I can tell this person has no resemblance at all to an actual Chinese person, except for perhaps the dress the clothing he's wearing. So what was going on in that reviewer? How was perception twisted so completely that you can look at this man, this white man, and not call that a caricature? I'm a little baffled by that. I continue to be. Charles Parslow used Austin as a basis for his other famous roles, including The Dainties in the Sierras by Joaquin Miller from 1877, which was very successful, and My Partner by Bartley Theodore in 1879. By the time of My Partner, Parslow's portrayal would have included at least 3 things that became primary signifiers of Chineseness: the accent, a comic bit with the Chinaman hiding stolen objects in his robes, one or more scenes whose comedy depended on the handling of the queue, and the queue being the long ponytail or long piece of hair worn by Chinese men at the time. Here's a caricature on the right-hand side, and the queue you can see flying up in the back. Metzger tells us visual recognition of the Chinamen depended, I contend, on the queue. Now, there were other markers like robes and blouses, but they varied in appearance and style. There was some makeup used that could signify Asianness, particularly to create the folds in the eyes, the epicanthic folds, but would not have been very visible in a larger theater. The queue, however, is visible from a distance, and as Metzger says, its ubiquity in print media meant that it would have been easy for urban audiences to recognize it as a signifier of Chineseness. There was also an association of Chinese people with opium, which was another aspect of their deviance, their otherness, their evilness, if you will. This here is a video of a, what would you call this? It's like not a game, but it was a panorama, a diorama, sorry, in an automated diorama in this arcade I found in San Francisco. And I took this video, and it's a representation from the 1950s, I think, of an opium den, and you can see the popular, all of the ideologies of the heathenness, evilness, deviance of the Chinese that are associated with them as being purveyors of vice through opium. You put your coin in here and it would start, and you just watch the figures move, and that was entertainment for people. So was this actually seen as authentic? Metzger contends that no. He says, no one thinks Parslow is actually Chinese, even if he acts convincingly. His performance serves as a convenient fiction that he literally enacts over and over again to secure its veracity. i.e. Chinese people are foolish, and even if dangerous, they can be controlled. Metzger tells us that the acceptance of Parslow's character suggests that complexity of actual experiences of Chinese immigrants were specifically what spectators paid to keep off stage. So I guess it's that not that people thought they were looking at actual Chinese people, but they were looking at their own perception of Chinese people, their wish fulfillment of what they wanted to reduce Chinese people to, and in repeating it and reinforcing it, they gained control over this other population, even if only fictitiously. It's interesting to note that Metzger does point out two instances of reviewers that did not think that Parslow's representation was very authentic, and they say do very similar things. Gary Skarnhorst in 1877 says, if the whole purpose of this piece is, as the playwright asserts, to afford an opportunity for the illustration of Chinese character, the whole purpose of the piece is as yet unaccomplished. It so far fails to give any illustration of Chinese character whatever, and presents us with an American burlesque. A burlesque being an exaggerated parody of sorts for comedic purposes. Spirit of the Times echoes this. If Mark Twain supposes for one moment that this character, as enacted, is a correct portraiture of the Chinaman, he is mistaken. It is a reflection of the American burlesque of the Chinaman. So here we see the tension that we currently still experience. Folks who have a realistic view that caricatures of Chinese people have no bearing on reality, and others who fear the otherness or are made uncomfortable perhaps by the otherness of Chinese, Asian folk generally, Chinese people. And so to alleviate that discomfort, they persist in these narratives of otherness, deviance, invasion, that are associated commonly with Asian peoples. And we see that has come to a head today with the association with the spread of the COVID-19 virus. People are looking for something to blame. You don't want to blame your neighbors, so you blame the people that you see as visually being as different from you as you can imagine. Not you personally, but people who have this mindset. So why does it matter that there's this history of representation of Asian peoples by non-Asian peoples through caricature and makeup and exaggeration? That Asians are an alien presence in America, no matter how long they have resided in the US, nor how assimilated they are, is still prevalent in American culture. And right up until today, we still see instances of yellowface that help perpetuate the displacement that Moy argues was part of the exhibitionist gaze. R. Lee tells us that yellowface marks the Oriental as indelibly alien. Constructed as a race of aliens, Orientals represent a present danger of pollution. An analysis of the Oriental as a racial category must begin with the concept of the alien as a polluting body. So we have to understand that this is the impulse that this creates. Not all foreign objects, however, are aliens, only objects or persons whose presence disrupts the narrative structure of the community. So as we've seen in narratives against immigrants generally, yellowface helps perpetuate the otherness of Asians and Asian Americans and constructs them as something outside of the American experience. And so perhaps a threat to it, hard to say. What's interesting, an interesting consideration and what Metzger points out is that yellowface doesn't necessarily treat Asian people in the same way that other representations of minority groups by white people have others. So basically he says, while John Augustus Stone celebrated the heroism of the strong individual in Metamora through the noble savage, and George L. Aiken lamented the plight of the human slave in Uncle Tom's Cabin, Ah Sin diverges from these representations. Ah Sin has no death scene that generates sympathy for his character. His actions until the very end seem motivated only by his greed and penchant for mischief. Even though there were plenty of representations of Native Americans and slaves that were completely derogatory and caricaturish, there were instances, at least in a few of them, being treated sympathetically and their humanity at least being considered as theoretically possible. But that you don't get examples of that in yellowface. That's just nowhere to be found. So that's the end of my presentation here, and I hope that that sheds a little bit of light on the genealogy that is representation of Chinese people. It's very brief, very surface analysis here, but it does kind of give you a sense of the vestiges of that that still survive into today. How we look at people matters. The images that we are presented with, the words that we have people say, the behaviors that we consume through media and that we approve of by purchasing tickets and producing plays and perpetuating these narratives have actual impacts on people in the real world. And I think we can't underestimate that.